Like I said, my name is Richard Harrison, and I've been asked to speak on the Soviet reconquest of Ukraine during 1943-44. As in many things, the reconquest of the Ukraine had its inception with the encirclement of the German Sixth Army at Stalingrad. Here, the Germans lost one entire army, the Sixth, part of another, Fourth Panzer, and two Allied armies, Third and Fourth Romanian, on the flanks. And the Soviets began to not only encircle the Sixth Army, they were pleasantly surprised that there were far more prisoners, far more people in the pocket than they had ever imagined. Their intelligence was way off. And at least was a happy result for them. And they began to push westward, taking out in succession the Italians along the Middle Don River and then the Hungarians on the Upper Don. So by late January, this enormous hole, several hundred kilometers in width, has been torn in the Axis front in South Russia, and the Soviets are pouring in, taking advantage of that. So by the beginning of February, the Red Army has actually crossed into the modern borders of Ukraine and has crossed the Donetsk River here. The Soviet strategy at this point is to, there's Izium of recent fame, is to attack through Izium, Krasnograd, and then by turning to the southwest, pass through Zaporozhye, and reach the coast of the Sea of Azov, even as the Germans at the same time are pulling out their forces from the Northern Caucasus. The Germans see the threat of the Soviets coming in, cutting off the German path of retreat to Rostov. As late as January, you still have German units several hundred miles deep in the foothills of the Caucasus. The Soviets are actually far closer to these choke points than the Germans are. And so the Germans fight a valiant struggle to keep this opening here at Rostov open, so that they can pull their forces through here before the Soviets manage to plug the gap. They just managed to do it. Rostov falls on February 14th. The Soviets again are across the Donetsk River, and in certain areas around Zaporozhye are within just a few miles of the lower reaches of the Dnieper River. Again, the Germans managed to just do it in time, and von Manstein collects his forces on either side of the Soviet salient here. And this attack was being launched by the Southwestern Front, headed by General Batutin, who had the unfortunate habit of running his offensive beyond their natural limit, beyond the extent to which they could be effectively supported. So his forces are well worn down because the Soviets have basically been attacking continuously since the end of November 42. So by February of 43, they're far outrun their supply lines. The units are worn down, and just a few dozen tanks really are spearheading this attempt to cut off the Germans against the Sea of Azov. And von Manstein is able to take advantage of the Soviet overextension and launch counterattacks along both flanks, pushing the Soviets back across the Donetsk River. Subsequent attacks are able to recapture Kharkov, and could you lower that just a bit? But they are unable to get rid of the Kursk salient here, which, of course, as per the previous speech, becomes the focal point for the next phase of the war. So the first Soviet attempt to reconquer Ukraine basically ends in failure, although they still hold a part of the eastern section in the Donbass area. Also, I wanted to back up here just a second. I have to apologize to anyone's sensibilities here for my pronunciation of Ukrainian place names. My pronunciation of these names does not in any way apply approval of Russian territorial pretensions today. It's just the way I was raised in the language, so to speak. So then the Rasputitsa, the roads are washed away. This sets in. Both sides are exhausted at the end of their tether, and things settle down for a couple of months until the Germans make their effort at Kursk. The Soviets at this time feel that they are actually the stronger party, but elect to take the first blow. But the Germans attack, expend themselves, and then counterattack. As we all know, the German attack fails. Now, it's an interesting point of our interpretation because the Germans think, despite their inability to achieve their objective, they think they have at least accomplished enough to forestall a Soviet summer offensive. Turns out this was not the case. The Soviets basically continued with their offensive plans they had in place, which started to take effect once the German offensive on Kursk has exhausted itself. Could you then move to the next slide? Now, this is a situation that the Red Army is faced with following the failure of the German attack at Kursk. At this time, the bulk of the Red Army's forces are in what they would call the southwest strategic direction, basically everything between the Sea of Azov and the Pripyat marshes up to the north. This is very convenient for them because their strategic objective is to recapture Ukraine with its agricultural and mineral riches. Also, the bulk of the forces that the Red Army disposed of is already in the southwest due to the previous fight against Stalingrad. So there's no need for any major regroupings of forces. They can basically fight where they stand already. So, unbeknownst to the Germans, who only realized this later following the failure of their offensive, unnoticed by them, I guess, is the fact that the strategic initiative has by now passed to the Red Army. Again, it takes a while for the Germans to realize it. So the Soviets now can basically attack wherever they want to. Also, the fact that the strategic initiative has passed over, and as the Soviet offensive will show, the Germans' hopes for conducting a mobile defense against superior forces are basically become a cropper because the Soviets can attack everywhere. This is the major advantage of having a strategic offensive. The Soviets are not overwhelmingly powerful. Let me give you some figures here. At the start of the offensive, the Soviets had 2,633,000 men, more than 2,400 tanks and self-propelled guns, more than 51,000 guns and mortars, and 2,850 combat aircraft in the air, according to contemporary Russian sources. Same sources state the Germans had 1,240,000 men, 2,100 tanks and assault guns, over 12,000 guns and mortar, and 2,100 combat aircraft. So the Soviet advantage, while impressive, is not overwhelming. But since the Soviets now have the strategic initiative, they can attack basically anywhere they want. And the Germans have to play catch up by constantly shifting units from one section of the front to another. And this is what happens. After the Battle of Kursk, the Soviets attack along the entire salient in the Oryol area and down at Kharkov to clear the shoulders of the salient so that then they can move forward on a broad front without fearing being taken in the flank from the north. And this is what happens at this point after following the Battle of Kharkov on August 23rd, 1943. The Germans launch the Soviets launch a large-scale offensive along the entire front, basically from the Vyazma area all the way down to the Sea of Azov. And the Germans, I guess for those who are familiar with the Western Front in World War II, this comparison will make a lot of sense. The German front at this stage in the east is like the German front in around Normandy in July 1943. The Germans are doing an excellent job with the resources they have of containing the Allied landing in Normandy. But the Allies just keep pumping more and more men and materiel into the beachhead until finally, at some time, the front is going to crack with disastrous results because there's nothing behind. There are no reserves really to speak of. And once that breakthrough is made, then the whole front begins to crumble. And this was certainly the case in this General Rokossovsky's central front. It breaks through here, and the Germans have nothing with which to fill the gaps. And pretty soon this spreads along the entire front. The attack was actually preceded by the Soviet offensive in the Donbass. So you have, and von Manstein writes about this, he's constantly, the Soviets are operating in terms of corps and armies to affect this breakthrough. Von Manstein is operating with divisions, trying to plug gaps along the front. And when the Soviets start banging away at the German front along the entire front, it's not very, it seems to go against all the rules of war that you concentrate your forces at one point. There's also the correlate that if you attack everywhere at the same time against a badly outnumbered opponent, you're going to break through at some point, which is what happens up here in the north with Rokossovsky, and soon the entire German front here begins to collapse. So by mid-September, Hitler has granted Manstein permission to fall back to the line of the Dnieper River. The Germans had some rudimentary defensive preparations along the Dnieper, but they were nowhere near completion. So by the end of September, the Soviets have already pretty much closed up to the Dnieper along most of its length. And even in some areas, Kaniv and north of Kiev, they've even succeeded in capturing small bridgeheads. And the next 2 months or so are spent the Germans unsuccessfully trying to get rid of these bridgeheads, and the Soviets just as unsuccessfully trying to expand it. Elsewhere in the south, the Soviets have advanced through the Donbass and close to the Molochная River here. This is the line of the Dnieper. And finally, in October, they are able to break through here and reach the mouth of the Dnieper here in the Black Sea, cutting off an entire German army and the Romanian allies in the Crimea. They can still be supplied, so it's not a repeat of Stalingrad, but basically these people are out of the war for the time being. Finally, after several futile attempts along the entire lower course of the Dnieper River to expand a bridgehead, the Soviets are able to, by switching forces, able to move an entire tank army north of Kiev and finally break out. See here, they take Kiev and move into southern Belarus. Meanwhile, further south, the Soviets are finally able to expand their bridgeheads here in the Cherkasy here in Dnepropetrovsk area, and create a sizable operational level bridgehead here. So you have one here and one here. The Soviets continue their offensive after Kiev, but again, Vatutin is in command of what is now called the First Ukrainian Front, and once again he allows himself to get dizzy with success, as the Soviets used to say, and push too far with too little, and the Germans slap him back very brusquely here at Zhytomyr, and he is forced to retreat, although he manages to hold on to Kiev. Could you go to the next slide, please? So basically, by the end of 1943, the Soviets have managed to create two large operational bridgeheads here in the Kiev area and down here in the Dnipropetrovsk area. The Germans have a small bridgehead still over the river here at Nikopol, which Hitler insists upon retaining. So you can see the Germans are dangerously forward here, while the Soviets are hanging over their left flank here. And the Soviets proceed to enhance their advantage in this area. After being pushed back at the end of November, the Soviets renew the offensive here to the west of Kiev, blast out of their bridgehead here, and advance some 200 kilometers to the west. and now are hanging very dangerously over the German front. And the Germans find themselves being stretched more and more. Again, Manstein complains about this all the time. You know, the front is beginning to crack, and he simply has no men to fill it. Meanwhile, the frontier is being extended to the south, and at this point, the Germans still retain a small foothold on the Dnieper, and it becomes so inviting that the Soviets decide to attack on either side. This is the famous Battle of Korsun-Shinkovsky, and they trap the greater part of two German corps in the encirclement, but the Germans are able to break out, although they suffered heavy losses and had to abandon most of their equipment. At this time, the Soviet fronts, now style the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th Ukrainian, numbered more than 2,200,000 men, 28,654 guns and mortars, 2,015 tanks and self-propelled guns, and 2,600 aircraft. They're opposed by 1,800,000 Axis troops, 16,800 guns and mortars, 2,200 tanks and assault guns, and nearly 1,500 aircraft. So actually, the correlation of forces, as they call it, is not as bad for the Germans as it was at the beginning of the battle for the Dnieper. But again, they're being stretched. The time and space are working against them. Their units are worn down, and they're just basically waiting for the next hammer blow, which takes place in March, where the 1st Ukrainian front, taking advantage of its flanking position, rams 3 tank armies and begin to drive south. They are met by the 2nd Ukrainian front under General Konyev, who drives to the southwest. They end up circling the 1st Panzer Army here in the Mogilev area, Mogilev-Podolsk area. But again, the Soviets proved incapable of sealing the encirclement, and the Germans are able to break out to the west and save their army. The same thing here is repeated as the Soviets try to clear the end of the Dnieper River. They managed to cut off the 6th Army, which has been reconstituted after Stalingrad. Not a very lucky army. They cut them off again against the Black Sea, but the Germans are able to break the ring and fall back to the west. So throughout March, April, and the beginning of May, the Soviets are advancing along a broad frontier in western Ukraine, and finally by mid-April, they have reached the mouth of the Dniester and even entered into northern Romania. So now, and thus the Rasputitsa, or the bad road season, kicks in, and combat operations cease for the time being, particularly as the Soviet Summer 44 plan calls for the main effort to be made in Belarus, which entails a good deal of regrouping to the north. And finally, the last one, please.
Okay.
Drive to reconquer Ukraine. This is the Lvov operation conducted by, I think by now, Marshal Konyev's 1st Ukrainian front. And the object is to break through, capture Lvov, which is a major rail hub in western Ukraine. But the loss of Lvov would actually mean the semi-isolation of Army Group South and Army Group North Ukraine from the rest of the German forces here in Belarus. It would entail a very circuitous rail route in order to keep these armies supplied. So the Soviet plan is to cut off German forces in the Lvov area and capture that city, and then push into southeastern Poland. This is another operation involving 3 tank armies, huge concentrations of armor. 1st Guards Tank Army here, also with a cavalry mechanized group, is pretty successful in breaking through to the north of Lvov. To the south, things go less well. 2 tank armies. The infantry manages to punch a hole just a few kilometers wide but it's insulated by artillery, which you're not supposed to do. You're not supposed to commit your armor when your tanks can be destroyed by enemy artillery. But the Soviets have no choice. So basically, they shoehorn two tank armies into this very narrow breach, but it's enough to turn the tide, and they blast through, capture Lvov, cut off several German divisions here, and by late July, early August, have actually established a significant bridgehead across the Vistula River in southern Poland. In January 45, they will use this bridgehead in order to take part in the so-called Vistula Oder operation, which will reconquer all of Poland and go into German Silesia. So the prerequisites for that operation have now been created. Now, just to sum up, the Soviet conquest of Ukraine shows just how far the Red Army had come in 2 years of just terrible combat, which we people who have studied the operations in Western Europe cannot conceive of the intensity and the savagery of it. They have come a long way from the dark days of 1941-42. They still have a good ways to go. But at least at the strategic and operational level, they're drawing more or less even with their German counterparts. Tactically speaking, the German soldier, the individual German soldier, is still superior. And then will remain so even until 1945. Now, much of the credit for this is due to the Red Army's growing superiority in materiel. Whereas the first 2 years of the war, the Soviets were able to put to advantage their numerical superiority, their manpower superiority, to gain what victories they could. By late 43 and certainly in 44, the Soviet military economy is kicked into high gear, as has the American, for example, and you find increasing large numbers of equipment arriving at the front. The Soviets tend to be rather free in expending these, so equipment losses are astronomically high, but they just simply replace them with another tank. I recall reading calculations. The Soviets, having about 25,000 tanks at the start of the war, produced about 100,000 during the course of the war. At the end of the war, they had some 10, 12,000 tanks. So a lot of these tanks are simply being destroyed. In fact, the Soviets expected them to be destroyed. And therefore, these tanks tended to be quite fairly simple in construction, not very comfortable, and not built actually to have a long life. With the expectation within a week or two that they would simply be destroyed and replaced by another. It's a rather brutal but practical way of looking at things. And this is just at the time when German industrial war production is beginning to decline. Problems remain, however. Most notable that the war in Ukraine here has highlighted is the Germans' inability or near inability to carry out an encirclement operation. We've seen, of course, in Shenkovsky, that part of the German force got away. Here, down here with the First Panzer Army, the First Panzer Army broke out of the encirclement. Down in the south, the Sixth Army breaks out. So, except for the Lvov encirclement here, the Soviets have not been able to replicate Stalingrad with any degree of success. And it is not until 1945 when their own superiority becomes so obvious and geographical conditions favor this that they were actually able to encircle large numbers of German forces. So, that concludes my rather hurried explanation of recounting of the Soviet reconquest of Ukraine during this time. I can answer any questions you might have on this subject. Yes.
I was just wondering, do you feel that any of this had influence in Russian military thinking as it's occurred recently? Is there anything about this that maybe influenced?
No, not that I can tell, or at least if it is influenced by. I've noticed when it comes to matters of theory, this is my reading of Soviet military theory, interwar and wartime, before World War II and during World War II, is, in any army, the gap between theory and practice is always, varies. There's always a gap. With the Red Army, it's enormous. The theory is quite logical. It makes a lot of sense, but getting it down to particularly the mid-level commanders who actually carry it out, there's no follow through. I mean, you're still having the same, you're launching frontal attacks and unsupported by tanks and it's, school, grade school stuff like that, and that's not getting down there. So, and it seems to be the case today. You're dealing, military traditions, for good or ill, seem to carry on, even if the regime changes. So, you see some things of similar that they're doing in a similar fashion, the same rather ham-handed approach to conducting an offensive and keeping a supply. As we've seen in Ukraine now, that they've done a woefully bad job in supplying them. And this has been again, it's been one of the Achilles heels of the, say, 20th century Russian army / Soviet army / Russian army again, is actually keeping your men supplied. I've read documents, Soviet era, World War II era documents where, higher ups are complaining about logistical problems and even mentioning cases where individual soldiers have starved to death. I mean, this is a modern army, and you've got people going hungry who are doing the fighting for you and expected to shoulder the burden of the war. Then, at best they're underfed. In the cases I cited, they're starving it. This is no way to run a war. And obviously the same things are being repeated. Now, at least the Red Army could say in its favor that it was learning the lessons, however slowly. The learning curve was very gradual here. And you got to see, there obviously much larger forces are engaged on the German side and the Soviet side than is the case right now. And the Soviets are, give them credit, they're fighting the Germans, who are very serious soldiers, and probably, again, probably the best army in the world, man for man. So the fact that they one can only do a time comparison, it takes basically 8 months from the end of August 43 to July. Well, maybe a little more. Well, let's cut out the Lvov operation, but the much greater part of Ukraine is reconquered by the Red Army within the space of about 8 months, from end of August 43 to end of April 44. The Russian army has now been fighting Ukrainians for 7 months, and they have, in comparison, made minimal gains, and again against an opponent far less capable than the German army. So, if anything, one could speak of a decline in the Russian military art, as evidenced by the current war.
Dr. Zoe, several questions to the board.
So at least according to Krivoshev, quarters 3 and 4 of 1943 are probably some of the bloodiest that the Soviets ever experienced. Right. Could you kind of talk about what is the impact of this, not so much on the operational side, but basically the tactical level performance of the Soviet army as these casualties bite into the men who had had the first half of 1943 to train together as units?
Well, my reading of the Soviet Army's performance overall is they never catch up from the initial shattering blow of the start of the German offensive. You have a 5 million man cadre army in June 1941. It gets massacred. I think the figure I read somewhere was 2% of those who were serving in the Soviet Army at the start of the war were alive at the end of it. Yeah, something like that. I mean, or at least in the Army. Yeah. So the thing is,
It's amazing.
now you can say what you want about this, the quality of the Soviet cadre army in 1941. But it is so shattered by the initial force of the German blow and the subsequent fighting, a lot of it counteroffensive by the Soviets, that it's constantly being remade. It's like it's being remade. And this works in the Soviets' disfavor because you constantly have this huge intake of people coming in who are not trained, or at least poorly trained. And the losses at the front have been so severe that there's nobody to pass on useful everyday advice on how to stay alive. That chain has been broken. And so the new intake is taking heavier casualties than they normally would have. And the process gets repeated over and over. That obviously works against the Soviets. What works in their favor, and much to the amazement of the Germans, is from the German point of view, is the incredible ability of the Red Army to constantly regenerate itself. So where are these getting these people? How can they come here? And they're doing it like someone like they are today. When the Soviets come into an area, a liberated area, they don't even wait for the normal military commissariats to come in there and make this procedure of recruiting the people in the liberated area to the army. The fronts send out their press gangs and basically round these guys up, and they're shoved into the line. So there's never any time, even during lulls in the fighting, there's never any time for the Soviets to train the incoming troops and to any kind of acceptable level. And they eventually fall back on this strategy of завалить трупами. You simply crush the guy with your own corpse, the enemy. So and so they never, although people at the headquarters, again at the operational strategic level, they're improvement, they show market improvement. But at the tactical level, where it's actually coming to grips with the Germans, they're still inferior to the Germans well in the 45. Yes.
Can I extend that from what we just said? And the historiography, as I understand it, 1950s, 1960s, the West used to think the Germans were amazing because they held off the Russians for so long against superior numbers. And that's partly because we read German memoirs. As I grew up, it was the Soviets were amazing, not least because they were people like Ericsson, because of this quote, Soviet mastery of the operational level of war, which when I was at Star College, we were all told about. With due respect, I don't think that this is amazing. This goes on to the destruction of Army Group Centre. If we can imagine, I know this is counterfactual, the operations of Army Group Centre with another 10 Panzer divisions, the result would be completely reversed. Those 10 Panzer divisions were in the West, and they had to be in the West. My point is that I think what happened on the Eastern Front was a consequence of strategy, not Operation Art. Any views on that?
Well, strategy, of course, must inevitably call the shots.
Yeah.
And this speaks to the rottenness of German strategy.
Absolutely.
Obviously, which comes to proper very early on the war, and then begins to assert itself even more and more, as particularly after the Normandy invasion, when again so many units are pulled from the Eastern Front to fight in the West. Yeah, you're probably right. Considering the enormous tank casualties that the Soviets suffered, even in the highly successful Belarusian operation, at the hands of just two German panzers. It's interesting to speculate what the Germans might have done had they had the men and material to oppose this. But and for me, the amazing thing about World War II, at least in the West, has always been the ability of the Germans to hold off as long as they did, hold out as long as they did, given the correlation of forces that was arrayed against it. Anybody else would have collapsed far more quickly. So,
One of our online participants has a question. Were the efforts of any rebels in the areas of Ukraine make any difference in your reading of Soviet documents?
I'm not sure I quite understand it, but the partisans or anti-Soviet partisans, the UPA, the Ukrainian rebellion army, were active in Western Ukraine. In fact, the Soviets lost a front commander, General Batutin, because he was out a little too far ahead of the troops and got ambushed by Ukrainian partisans, and he suffered a wound that later became infected. They amputated his leg, didn't save him, and he died. So they were running around there. Poor Ukrainians, they were partisans. They were sort of caught between a rock and a hard place, or several rocks and several hard places, because they're obviously trying to fight the Red Army as it approaches. They're also having to fight the anti-communist, you think they're allies, the anti-communist Polish partisans and the Home Army, who, because of the Lvov area, the Poles claim it, as well as the Ukrainians. So people who should normally be allies, the Polish underground, is trying to kill off the Ukrainian partisans as well. So they're really between these two millstones here being ground up. But and so in the further west you move in Ukraine, the more, would you say the greater the anti-Russian sentiment?
I suspect that the question was directed to pro-Soviet parties.
Pro-Soviet partisans.
There was a legend promoted in Soviet literature that was a strong pro-Soviet partisan movement, which was supported by Central Command in Moscow.
Well, certainly they played a role. Their role was more effective in Belarusia, where they had a much larger presence, rather than in Ukraine. And even in Ukraine, the partisans were more active in the northern part, where you still have the Polyesia, the marsh area. But again, as far certainly their contribution was not decisive. It was the situation at the front, which of course eased the partisans' activities, because the Germans had to throw in every man to hold the front lines and could not take care or clean up the partisan areas in the rear as they might have liked.